Here I'm going to walk you through the SD6 triggers algorithm on the disting EX. This is a sample playback mode. It plays samples from the micro SD card, particularly with drum triggers, drum samples in mind, but you can of course use any samples you like. It's 6 inputs by default, which could be repurposed for CV automation if you prefer. 4 outputs, which are assignable. At the moment we've just used a stereo pair, but we'll use some of the others later. And just to explain the rest of this patch to you, for the demo I've got an FH2 being the clock master and driving a whole load of clocks out. I've got my microstep here sequencing the kick and snare that you'll hear going into these 2 triggers, and I've got 2 disting Mark IVs here generating some Euclidean patterns which are generating the other 4 triggers, and then stereo out into the mixer so you can hear it. So I'm going to load up some presets so you can see what's happening with there. First I'm going to load a mapping which I prepared so that we can use this MIDI fader module to control the levels of the different drum sounds I'm going to use. And then I'm going to load a preset from the SD card. I'm going to load a gold baby one, and I'm going to load the cassette 808 preset. It loads up the samples, and now if I press start on the FH2, we have our sequence. So all these triggers are going in, triggering the drum sounds, which are coming out. Now, basic parameters: the folder where it's going to load the samples from, and each of the 6 samples. Now you can see, as it triggers each one, it's giving a play indicator with the velocity and round robin and velocity switches if they were active, which they're not in this case. So if I want to select a different one, just turn the knob to select a different one. Let's say a different snare here, or rim. If I want to disable an input, I just turn that all the way down to zip to -1. That input is disabled, won't trigger anything, and you could use that as a CV input. So let's put that back to the snare. There we go. I've got snare, hi-hat, cymbal, clap, and now we're on to the outputs. Now, I'm going to skip those for now and just look at these gains. These gain parameters are the ones I've got under MIDI control. So if you can see on first fader, that's changing the gain of that drum, which is the bass drum, and so on for the rest. And so on, so that's handy. They've also got pan. Now this is the one I've got mapped to MIDI control. It's this one. You can hear that clap sound. So each sound has got individual pan. Envelope time, these are all set to infinite, which basically means it's going to play the whole sample until it stops, which is what you want most of the time. Each sample can be transposed. The snare there. Or tuned, fine-tuned. Now, choke groups are something you quite often like to have on cymbals, so let's listen to the cymbals. So at the moment, these 2 samples, which are these 2, are in a choke group, which means that one's going to cut off the other. If I change the choke group, you hear that longer cymbal is no longer getting cut off by the short hi-hat. So that's kind of useful. Saturation, each individual output can have saturation enabled so it doesn't clip, which is generally useful. I've actually tenuverters. Now, let's go back to what we skipped over earlier, which is the output assignments. By default, these are all assigned to outputs 1 and 2. Let's take sound 2, which is the snare, and assign it instead of to output 4. So there's our snare. which you can't hear because obviously there's nothing plugged into that, but let's plug it into something. We'll take this cable, which is now coming into this filter, and out through here into our little mixer, turn that on. So now we've got our filter on the snare drum coming out of its own dedicated output. We'll put that back into the stereo mix. Turn it off. So there you go, I think you've got the signable outputs. The next thing I want to mention is that these inputs are actually velocity sensitive. A lot of gates and modular are just on or off, but there are some devices, for example the FH2, which will send a velocity gate, which is a gate the amplitude of which is scaled by velocity. So we can create one of those by putting a normal gate through a VCA, which I have over here. So this trigger is in fact already running through the VCA, it's just all on, so you're not hearing the result. But let's hear what happens to that sound, which is number 6, when I turn the gain down on the VCA. Here the sound itself is actually getting quieter because the velocity is lower. And if this was a velocity switching patch, you'd actually be switching sample while you did that as well. And of course it doesn't need to be fixed, you could send a Modulation Cv into here. So this is an LFO that I've got coming from the FH2. So if I fade up the attenuator there, now my LFO is affecting the volume of that sample. So if I change this so it's a constant thing, you can maybe hear that a bit more clearly. So now the velocity of that note is being affected by the LFO, which is tempo sync, so it's all locked in. So there we go. So of course it's not just that one, all 6 of these are velocity sensitive, so you can create really quite dynamic drum parts by varying the velocities as well as the sounds themselves. Now these sounds also don't need to be particularly short. If I load a different preset, which I know has got some longer sounds on it, this one, then, and then let's change that sound so it's a bit more obvious. There we go, so that sound now is quite a long sample, as you can hear. And indeed, these don't have to be drum samples. Let's change this to something completely different. Let's use the Lab Soft Piano. Slow this down. This might not be what you would normally do. You might use the multi-sample mode more normally for this, but just to make the point that these samples can be super long, stereo, and generally lovely. They don't have to be little drum samples. So there, the SD6 triggers mode on the Disting EX.